June 14, 1944, 8 days after D-Day. The hedgerow country of Normandy felt like a maze built by the devil himself. 2 miles south of Carentan, Staff Sergeant Michael Kovalski's M4A1 Sherman jolted to a halt behind a stone wall, the engine coughing like it was dying too. Through his periscope he caught sight of another Sherman, 300 yards ahead, completely swallowed by fire. Thick black smoke climbed into the sky like a warning. The crew had bailed out, sprinting through the tall grass. One guy wasn't fast enough. Another turned back to drag him. Kovalski watched both men vanish in a flash as a second round slammed into the disabled tank and set off the ammo inside. The blast sent the turret flying 12 feet into the air. 4 Shermans in 20 minutes. 4. He keyed the radio. Baker. 2-3 to Baker Actual. We've got a concealed 88 in the tree line. Request smoke and withdrawal authorization. Static crackled before the reply snapped back. Baker 2-3 negative on withdrawal. Intelligence reports minimal armor presence. Proceed with advance. Kovalski clenched his jaw. Minimal armor presence. Sure. Somewhere miles away in some clean, quiet HQ tent, someone was reading yesterday's recon reports, while 5 tank crews burned alive in today's reality. He glanced over at his loader, Private Danny Castellano, just 19 from Brooklyn, checking the ready rack with trembling hands. 4 75mm HE rounds there, 17 more in the turret basket racks, 30 packed into the sponson bins along the hull sides, sitting right above the tracks. 51 rounds total, 51 chances for this steel box to turn into a crematorium. Driver, advance 50 yards. Gunner, watch that tree line. The Sherman groaned forward. Corporal James Morrison, the gunner, swept his periscope across the hedgerow. I don't see anything, Sarge. No muzzle flash, no movement. He's there, Kovalski muttered. He took out 4 of ours. He's waiting. They rolled 30 yards. The stone wall faded behind them. Now they were exposed, nothing but open field, framing them like a target on a firing range. Kovalski's palms slipped on the commander's controls. Every instinct screamed to back up, to get behind cover, but orders were orders. Minimal armor presence. Proceed with advance. The hit came low, punching through the right sponson at a shallow angle. Kovalski felt the impact before he heard it, a brutal metallic crack followed by a pressure wave that squeezed the air out of the compartment. The shell shattered on entry, spraying molten fragments through the crew space. One jagged piece tore into the sponson ammo rack. The 75mm charges ignited instantly. Bang, bang, bang. The side of the tank erupted in a violent chain reaction. 30 rounds cooking off, one after another, each blast feeding the next. In less than 3 seconds, the temperature inside soared from 80 degrees to over 400. Castellano screamed as the ready rack behind him caught fire. 4 rounds detonated at once, turning his position into a furnace. Kovalski grabbed him, trying to drag him towards the commander's hatch, but the kid's uniform was already burning. Morrison moved faster. He kicked open his hatch and bailed out in one motion, hitting the engine deck hard. Kovalski shoved Castellano toward the open hatch. The kid wasn't moving anymore, just screaming. Kovalski got him halfway out before another explosion in the turret basket slammed the hatch shut like a steel trap. The force threw Kovalski backward into the radio set. Blood filled his mouth. His left arm wouldn't respond. Thick, toxic smoke closed around him like a blanket. He couldn't see Castellano, couldn't see anything. He found the commander's hatch by touch. The metal burned through his gloves, but he forced it open with his shoulder and hauled himself out. Fresh air slapped him across the face. He rolled off the turret, fell 6 feet to the ground, and started crawling with whatever strength he had left. Behind him, the Sherman kept exploding, ammo cooking off, flames shooting from every hatch and vision port. He crawled 20 yards before his arms gave out. He collapsed in the grass and watched his tank die. Morrison found him 5 minutes later. The gunner's face was scorched, his uniform still smouldering. "Where's Castellano?" he asked. Kovalski didn't respond. He didn't have to. They both knew. 3 miles to the east, in another hedgerow, a different story was unfolding. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes commanded a platoon of 4 Shermans, all M4A1 variants, with the new 76mm gun. More importantly, all 4 carried a designation Hayes barely noticed the first time he saw it. Stenciled on the hull, M4A176W. The W stood for wet-stowage. Hayes hadn't paid much attention when he first heard it. Some quartermaster sergeant back in England had rambled about redesigned ammo racks and fire suppression systems, but Hayes had been laser-focused on the upgraded cannon. A 76mm instead of a 75, a higher velocity punch that could actually bite through German armour. That was what mattered in a tank fight. That was what kept you alive. Or at least that's what he believed. His platoon was crawling through the same hedgerow country that had just swallowed Kovalski's crew whole. Same tight corners, same hidden anti-tank guns, same death-trap geometry. Hayes's lead tank, commanded by Sergeant William Drake, rounded a bend in the bocage, and a Panzer IV waiting 300 yards out fired first. The 75mm shell pierced the right side of Drake's hull, low and angled right through the sponson area. Hayes watched it all through his binoculars, bracing for the fireball he'd seen a dozen times, waiting for the turret to leap skyward, waiting to see burning figures escape, if they escaped at all. Nothing happened. The Sherman rocked from the impact. Smoke poured from the entry hole, but no secondary blast, no chain reaction, no ammo cooking off. The turret stayed where it belonged. 5 seconds later, Drake's gunner struck back. One clean blast from the 76mm cannon. The Panzer V's turret rang like metal, struck by a sledgehammer. The round tore straight through the frontal armour. The German tank choked, groaned, and stopped dead, smoke spilling from the engine deck. Drake's voice crackled over the radio. "Baker 3-1 to Baker Actual. We're hit but mobile. Right sponson penetration. No casualties. Ammunition, racks intact. Continuing advance." Hayes stared at the handset like it had just lied to him. No casualties? Ammunition racks intact? That was impossible. He'd watched Shermans brew up from hits just like that. He'd watched crews burn alive. Drake's tank should have been a funeral pyre. He keyed his mic. "Drake, say again. You took a penetrating hit in the sponson." "Affirmative," Drake replied. "Went right through the ammo rack area. Nothing cooked off. Rounds are stored in some kind of liquid containers down on the hull floor. Shell must have missed them. Liquid containers. Wet stowage." Hayes suddenly remembered the quartermaster's explanation, the one he'd brushed off. The new Shermans had completely redesigned storage. No more exposed shells sitting in the sponson shelves. Instead, the ammo was sealed inside bins on the hull floor, each one surrounded by a water and ethylene glycol mixture. If a shell penetrated the area, the liquid would spill out and smother flames before they could ignite the propellant. It sounded absurd, like something dreamed up in an engineer's fever dream. Who put water jackets around ammo bins and called it a day? But the system worked. Drake's crew was alive. The tank was still in the fight. That was the only thing that mattered. The platoon pushed on. Over the next 4 hours, Hayes's Shermans duked it out with 6 German tanks and 8 anti-tank guns. They took 11 penetrating hits. 3 tanks were disabled, tracks blown off, engines cooked, but not a single one brewed up. Not one ammo explosion, not one crew burned alive. Wet stowage did exactly what it was built for. It bought precious seconds. the difference between life and death, even when the tank itself was dying. By nightfall, Hayes had lost just one Sherman to mobility damage. 0 crew deaths. 3 men wounded, none seriously. When he radioed the company commander with the status, the reply came instantly. "What the hell kind of magic tanks are you driving?" Hayes looked over at his M4A176W, tucked behind a hedgerow. The right side was scorched black. From a near miss, the paint bubbled and peeling, but the crew was alive, sitting on the hull brewing coffee on a portable stove, cracking jokes about German aim. "Not magic," Hayes said into the radio, "just better engineering." 300 miles to the east, in a Wehrmacht tank depot outside Falaise, Oberleutnant Klaus Ferrer was staring at an intelligence report that made his blood run cold. Vera commanded a company of Panzer IVs, hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, now pulled west to halt the Allied push. The report detailed something deeply unsettling. American Sherman tanks were no longer erupting in flames when hit in the ammunition storage areas. Vera read the report again, and again, and again. It made no sense. The Sherman's vulnerability to ammo fires was legendary, something German tankers had exploited ruthlessly since North Africa. You hit the sponson, you hit the turret basket, you aimed for the ammo racks. That weakness was doctrine. It was reliable. It was supposed to be fatal. The Sherman had always been predictable in one grim way. Hit it in the right place, and it went up like a bomb. The ammunition would ignite, the tank would detonate from the inside out, and the crew would either die instantly or stumble out into a hail of machine gun fire. That was the formula. That was how you killed Shermans. And it was how Vera had chalked up 11 kills during the retreat from Kursk. But now something was off. Something had changed. The new intelligence reports were saying the impossible. Shermans were taking hits directly into their ammunition storage and not exploding. Crews were getting out alive. The dreaded brew-up was becoming rare. When Vera gathered his commanders and read the report aloud, the reaction was immediate. Snorts of disbelief, muttered curses, outright dismissal. "Propaganda," scoffed Feldwebel Ernst Becker, leader of the 1st Platoon. "The Americans want us thinking their tanks can't be killed. Psychological warfare." "Maybe," Vera said. "Or maybe they fixed the problem, and if they did, we need to know how. Because our doctrine, it depends on killing Shermans fast. If they don't brew up anymore, we're fighting blind." The next morning, Vera's company found its answer the hard way. They hit an American armoured column near Villers-Bocage. 8 Shermans rolled across open farmland in loose formation, no infantry cover, moving with the kind of confidence that annoyed Vera deeply. They were exposed, reckless, perfect targets. Vera positioned his Panzer Pfeifers in a tree line, hull down with clear firing lanes. Textbook ambush. His gunner locked onto the lead Sherman at 800 meters. Target acquired. Sherman. Range 800. Permission to fire. Fire. The 75mm cannon thundered. The shell slammed into the Sherman's right side, punching through the sponson just above the tracks. Vera leaned into his optics, waiting for the familiar mushroom of fire, waiting for the turret to blast off, waiting for the crew to die. Instead, the Sherman merely staggered. Smoke streamed from the hole. The tank ground to a halt, tracks wrecked, but still no fire. No ammo detonation, no catastrophic blast. Then the impossible happened. The Sherman's turret swung smoothly toward Vera's firing line. 5 seconds after being hit, the American tank fired back. The round went high, hissing over Vera's Panzer IV and exploding in the trees behind them. Close, too close. Another German gun fired. A second Panzer IV hit the Sherman again, this time in the turret front. The shell bounced off the mantelet, sparking a bright flash across the cast steel. The Sherman fired again. This time it struck the 2nd Panzer 4 dead center in the hull. The German tank erupted instantly, fire, smoke, and the deafening roar of ammunition cooking off in a deadly chain reaction. The crew never had a chance. Vera's stomach twisted. This wasn't how ambushes worked. His tanks were hidden, still perfectly sighted. His gunners were veterans. They had fired first. They had hit first. And somehow the Americans were pushing forward. The remaining Shermans accelerated, charging straight into the kill zone. It looked suicidal, charging an entrenched Panzer line, but they kept firing, kept advancing. High explosive shells ripped through the tree line, sending wood splinters and shards of metal spinning through the air like shrapnel. Vera's gunners fired 3 more rounds. 2 found their marks. 1 Sherman threw a track and skidded to a stop, crippled. But the other 5 stormed ahead, guns blazing, the 76mm rounds tearing through Panzer armour like it was tin. Vera ordered a withdrawal. 3 of his Panzer I-4s managed to pull back. 2 burned where they stood. The Americans had 2 disabled tanks, none destroyed, no confirmed crew losses. That night, Vera wrote an unvarnished after-action report. He described exactly what he'd witnessed. Shermans shrugging off penetrating hits to ammo racks, crews surviving at unprecedented rates. German doctrine falling apart under new battlefield realities. He recommended immediate tactical adjustments. The report climbed the chain of command. 3 days later, it landed on the desks at Army Group B headquarters. The intelligence officers read it in silence, each page deepening their alarm. Vera wasn't alone. Similar reports were coming in from across Normandy. Shermans were surviving hits that would have killed them months earlier. Crews were escaping wrecked tanks and returning to the fight in new ones within hours. And German tank crews were beginning to feel it. The shift, the unease, the doubt, what had changed. 5,000 miles away in Detroit, the Answer rolled down an assembly line with rhythmic, industrial precision. In the Fisher Body Division, an arm of General Motors that had transformed itself from car manufacturing to war production, back in 1942, modified M4A3 Sherman tanks were coming off the line at a rate of 300 a month. Each one carried the same new marking. Each one bore the letter W, wet stowage. The word itself didn't sound dramatic, but it was a complete redesign of the Sherman's greatest weakness. Instead of storing ammunition in the exposed sponson racks, right where German shells loved to hit, the rounds were moved down to the hull floor and sealed inside protected bins surrounded by liquid-filled canisters. Nothing exotic, no secret superalloy, just smart engineering. Each bin held 10 rounds, separated by 3 little containers filled with a mix of water, ethylene glycol, and rust inhibitor. The Americans called the mixture ammo amps. If a shell managed to punch through the hull and strike the ammo rack, those containers ruptured instantly. The liquid spilled out, smothering the heat and snuffing any spark before it could ignite the propellant. That was it. Simple physics, simple chemistry, brutally effective. The system made the tank about 900 pounds heavier, but it slashed ammunition-related fires by 85%. In real terms, that meant crews finally had a genuine chance of surviving even when their tank was torn open. The Sherman was still outgunned by German heavy armour. No upgrade could change that. But it was no longer the flaming coffin everyone had feared. Production of the new M4 A176W variant began in January 1944. By April, 130 of those upgraded tanks had crossed the Atlantic and were sitting in English depots, ready for the D-Day invasion. But there was a catch. The new 76mm gun required extra crew training. Commanders worried that rushing the switch might slow the invasion's momentum. So the wet stowage Shermans waited in the wings while older, fire-prone models rolled onto the beaches of Normandy. It wasn't until July 25th, during Operation Cobra, the massive breakthrough that blew a hole in the German lines, that the first wet-stowage Shermans entered combat. The attack began with the heaviest tactical bombing in military history, leaving the German defence in ruins. American tanks poured through the gaps, and among them were the upgraded Shermans at last unleashed. The effect was immediate and obvious. Crews started surviving hits that would have killed them just weeks earlier. Tanks that should have exploded simply stalled out, armour punctured but ammunition intact. Penetrating rounds struck ammo racks, but instead of fireballs, there were only bursts of steam and leaking coolant. The system worked. It worked perfectly, and the news spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Sherman crews who'd watched friends burn alive in the older models felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Morale skyrocketed. Tactics became bolder. Commanders took risks they never would have considered before, because now they believed, truly believed, that they might actually survive a hit. By August 1944, Fisher Body Division was producing the next wave, the M4 A375W, same trusted 75mm gun, now paired with wet stowage. Production continued into March 1945, flooding Europe with survivable Shermans. As new tanks arrived, older ones were pulled from the line or written off entirely. The Germans noticed immediately. Intelligence reports described American tank crews fighting with a level of aggression no one had seen before. Shermans were charging into ambushes that should have been slaughterhouses, and surviving. Disabled tanks were holding defensive positions, crews unharmed, buying time until recovery vehicles could haul them back to friendly lines. The psychological edge of the classic brew-up-kill was disappearing. So German commanders adapted. If they couldn't count on the ammunition detonating, they shifted tactics, aiming for mobility kills, shooting tracks, engines, anything that would leave a Sherman stranded even if its crew lived. But even that wasn't easy anymore. American infantry and tank destroyers rarely let Shermans roll alone. The days of isolated ambush targets were over. Wet stowage didn't make the Sherman invincible, not even close. A German 88mm could still punch through its armour at typical fighting ranges. Panthers, with their deadly high-velocity guns, could engage from distances where the Sherman's return fire barely mattered. Tigers were still monstrous beasts that required teamwork to bring down. But the Sherman no longer died easily. In a brutal war of attrition, that single fact changed the entire equation. Staff Sergeant Michael Kovalski returned to duty in September 44 after recovering from his injuries. His new tank was an M4 A375W, and he noticed the differences right away. The ammo racks were set lower, protected inside sealed metal bins filled with those liquid canisters his loader kept talking about. "They call it wet stowage," the loader said, "supposed to keep us from cooking if we take a hit." Kovalski ran his hand across the smooth metal. "Does it actually work?" "I don't know, Sarge," the loader replied. "Haven't been hit yet. Let's keep it that way." 3 weeks later, near Aachen, they didn't have that choice. A Panther spotted them at 700 meters and fired. The shell hit the right sponson, exactly where Kowalski's friend Castellano had died in the old Sherman, exactly where Kovalski expected to die too. The impact slammed him sideways into the turret wall. Smoke gushed into the compartment. His ears rang. The loader was screaming, but there was no fire, no flash, no chain reaction tearing the tank apart. Just smoke, the sharp tang of ruptured liquid, and the sound of coolant hissing from the shattered wet stowage bins. Here's your rewritten Part 5 in a smooth, engaging storytelling voice with the same length and no timestamps. Kovalski grabbed the loader and shoved him up toward the commander's hatch. The kid scrambled out first, coughing but very much alive. The gunner slipped through his own hatch. The driver and assistant driver dove out through the bow hatches, and finally Kovalski hauled himself out of the smoking turret and rolled off the engine deck. For the first time in his career, every man made it out. 5 crew members, 0 casualties. He lay flat in the grass, chest heaving, eyes fixed on his burning tank. The ammunition bins were still sealed, still holding back disaster, even as the engine fire crept forward. Eventually the heat would reach the rounds and they'd cook off, but by then the crew was already 200 yards away, safe behind friendly lines. Kovalski thought of Castellano, the kid who'd burned to death because the ammunition had detonated 3 seconds after the shell hit. He thought of the 11 other crews he'd watched die the same way during Normandy. The wet-stowage system wouldn't bring them back. It wouldn't erase the horror of watching a friend disappear in fire. But it meant the next crews wouldn't have to die like that. It meant someone else's story wouldn't end in a flash of orange light. That alone made the extra £900 worth hauling, worth shipping across the Atlantic, worth every late night an engineer spent drafting the new system. Kovalski pushed himself to his feet, brushed off dirt and soot, and started walking toward the company commander's position to request a replacement tank, preferably another M4A375W. Because he finally understood something important. Survival didn't come from being invincible. It came from buying seconds. And on a battlefield, a handful of seconds was the line between going home and becoming another line on a casualty report. The development of wet stowage had started back in November 1943, when a DuPont chemical engineer sitting in on a tank board meeting floated a wild idea: surround the ammunition with liquid. At first, the proposals bordered on the absurd. Some engineers imagined flooding the entire fighting compartment, turning Shermans into half-submerged machines, where crews would operate in sealed suits like submarine crews. Someone even suggested rebreathers to let tankers operate underwater. Thankfully, cooler heads showed up, and the idea evolved into something actually usable. Instead of flooding the crew space, they designed double-walled ammunition bins with liquid-filled chambers built into the hull floor, tucked away from the angles most likely to get hit. The ammunition wouldn't sit in water. Instead, each round would be separated by containers of suppression fluid. Finding the exact right liquid, though, that became its own puzzle. Water worked but froze in winter and rusted brass cartridges. Ethylene glycol solved the freezing problem but sped up corrosion and could even ignite under the right conditions. After months of testing, the engineers settled on a proprietary mixture called Amudamp, ethyl sodium potassium phosphate with rust inhibitors and biocides. It stayed liquid down to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, wouldn't corrode anything, prevented bacterial growth, and smothered fire better than plain water ever could. Each 10-round ammunition rack used 3 sealed chambers of this fluid. The 75mm Shermans held 97 rounds, protected by 38 gallons of the mixture. The 76mm versions carried 71 rounds with 36 gallons guarding them. The tanks gained 900 extra pounds, but the payoff was immediate. Crews lived. In Pennsylvania, Press Steel Car Company retooled its factory in December 1943. On January 3, 1944, the first M4A 176W rolled out. Fisher Body Division followed soon after, with the M4A 375W eventually producing 3,711 of them between February 1944 and March 1945. by the end of the war, almost every Sherman built after January 1944 had wet stowage. More than 30,000 tanks carrying the life-saving upgrade were deployed across Europe and the Pacific. The difference in survival rates was staggering. The earlier Shermans burned in 60 to 80% of penetrating hits. The wet stowage models burned in only 10 to 15% of cases, an 85% drop. Put another way, a battalion of 50 Shermans taking 30 penetrating hits might have lost up to 24 tanks to fire before the upgrade. With wet stowage, only 3 to 5 would be consumed by flames, leaving more than 24 salvageable, fixable, and ready to be thrown back into the fight. It didn't just save lives, it preserved whole combat units. Battalions that would have needed to be rebuilt from scratch after a major fight were instead still functional, still dangerous, still rolling forward. Experienced tank commanders survived long enough to become veterans and then mentors. Replacement crews learned from people who had actually lived through it. Entire armoured divisions kept their institutional memory. And the Germans? They never figured out why the Americans suddenly stopped dying the way they used to. Here's your rewritten final part. Same length, no timestamps, full storytelling tone. German technical intelligence captured hundreds of wet stowage Shermans from Normandy all the way to the Rhine. They photographed them, measured every angle, test-fired the guns, and analysed the armour plate composition. But somehow they never recognized the quiet little miracle sitting inside those tanks, the liquid-filled ammunition containers. Late 1944 German intelligence reports did acknowledge that Shermans were surviving more hits than before, but they chalked it up to better crew training or tighter coordination with infantry and air support. Some analysts guessed the armour must have improved. Others thought American crews were bailing out faster, abandoning tanks that still had a chance of being repaired. No one pointed to the real reason, this hidden modification sitting right there inside the ammo racks, visible to anyone who bothered to open a single bin. But German intelligence was drowning under collapsing logistics, losing experienced analysts, and obsessing over wonder weapon projects that never delivered what they promised. By early 1945, the few specialists still functioning were busy examining jets and rockets, not captured enemy tanks that Germany couldn't match in production or counter effectively in the field. Because of that, the one piece of information that could have changed German tactics never reached the front. Tank commanders kept relying on ammunition fire strategies against an enemy that, thanks to wet stowage, no longer died the way they used to. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes made it through the war. His platoon of M4A 176W Shermans fought from Normandy all the way to the Elbe River, clashing with German armour dozens of times. They lost 11 tanks from combat hits, 7 were repaired and sent right back into the fight. 4 were total write-offs from catastrophic penetrations, but none, absolutely none, went up in flames from ammunition detonation. Hayes brought every man in his platoon home alive, 20 tankers who, by all previous statistics, would have died inside earlier model Shermans. In 1947, Hayes attended a veterans reunion. That's where he met Staff Sergeant Michael Kovalski. They'd never served together, never crossed paths in battle, but they instantly understood each other. Both had watched crews die in dry stowage Shermans. Both had survived hits in wet stowage tanks that should have killed them. They stood side by side at the reunion, staring at a restored M4A 375W on display. A section of the hull had been cut open so people could see the ammo racks, the sealed bins, the liquid chambers, the stripped-down engineering fix that had saved thousands. Hayes asked, "Did you know what it was when you first saw it?" Kovalski shook his head. No idea. Loader told me it was supposed to keep us from burning. He paused. I didn't believe him until it actually worked. How many times did you get hit? Hayes asked. 4 times in wet storage tanks, Kovalski said. Walked away from all of them. We lost 1 tank completely, but the crew survived. The other 2 were repairable. They fell silent for a moment before Kovalski finally spoke. The memory that never left him. I knew a kid named Castellano, 19 years old, loader, died in the first tank I ever commanded. Ammo cooked off, burned to death in about 5 seconds. Hayes nodded slowly. I lost 11 friends the same way in Normandy, before the new tanks came. You think about them every day. The wet stowage system didn't bring back those men. It didn't erase the horror of North Africa, Sicily, or the early Normandy landings where tank crews burned by the hundreds. But once the modification reached frontline units in 1944, the death rate from ammunition fires dropped by 85%. Thousands of American, British, Canadian, and Free French tank crews survived hits that would have killed them months earlier. The Sherman's legacy has been argued over for decades. Critics talk about its weaker armour, its gun being no match for German heavy tanks. Defenders point out its reliability, its volume of production, and the way it fit perfectly into combined arms doctrine. But no matter which side you're on, one fact stands untouchable. Wet stowage transformed the Sherman from a rolling coffin into a tank that gave its crew a real chance. And in war, that's all any soldier can ask for. If this story moved you, we'd be honoured if you'd like this video. It genuinely helps us keep bringing stories of courage and innovation to you. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, your country, your city. We love hearing from people around the world. Did someone in your family serve in World War II? Maybe you knew a tanker or heard stories about Shermans from veterans. Share those memories. They matter more than you know. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so we can honour the engineers who designed this life-saving system, the factory workers who built it, and the thousands of tank crews whose lives it protected. These stories deserve to be preserved. They must never be forgotten.